There are numerous other stories in the Sanskrit epics and elsewhere that emphasize Brahmanical power. Presumably such stories spread and were appreciated, creating in many the conviction that one should not cross Brahmins, and that it was always better to have them on one's side. This would be a good reason for rulers to support Brahmins, and if there were none around, to invite them to come to their kingdom. Brahmanism, as it presented itself, was not a new phenomenon, and had never been. Brahmanical literature is at pains to point out that it had been around for a long time. The main events of the Mahabharata and Ramayana are situated in an imprecise but remote past. Quite apart from the main story, the Mahabharata reminds its readers and listeners of the fact that a Brahmin had killed off all warriors, that is, kings, 7 times over because they had misbehaved. Clearly Brahmanical power was already superior to royal power in the remote past, and it was in the interest of all to maintain good relationships. Brahmins therefore pose a threat, but they can also be of great help. Once again, history as presented by the Brahmins can illustrate this. The Great Maurya Empire, that to the modern historian looks like something that had been a disaster for Brahmanism, was presented as a Brahmanical creation. The founder of this empire, Chandragupta, had succeeded in creating this empire, supposedly by following the advice of his Brahmanical counselor, Chanakya. What is more, this same Chanakya, who had as much as created the Maurya Empire, was also thought of as the author of the classical Sanskrit text on statecraft, the Arthasastra. All the wisdom united in this work was at the disposition of rulers who were ready to appoint a Brahmin as chief advisor. None of these claims are confirmed by modern scholarship. If it slowly becomes clear what risks can be avoided and what advantages gained by pleasing Brahmins, there is one other factor that must have played a role in their extraordinary success. At least in theory, Brahmanical advisors do not aspire to kingship. Brahmins are therefore not only the most competent and most powerful advisors, they are also safe in the sense that they will not try to replace the king they advise. Our reflections so far explain more or less why a king might wish to be assisted by Brahmanical advisors. It does not yet explain why he would reward Brahmins with agraharas, that is, estates, with sources of steady income away from the capital. Clearly agraharas were often rewards for services rendered. But not only that, many agraharas, it appears from the inscriptions, were given to Brahmins who were not involved in the running of the state, but who excelled in this or that aspect of traditional Brahmanical learning. The recipients of agraharas were supposed to live lives dedicated to ritual practice and Brahmanical learning, following the example of the Brahmanical sages in their hermitages, depicted in the epics and elsewhere. This, as we have seen, was deemed to increase the merit of the donor or of those close to him. We may conjecture that kings somehow felt they could harness Brahmanical power in this way, even though I am not aware of any texts that explicitly put it this way. It appears, then, that Brahmins often came to be asked by local rulers to settle in their kingdoms. In such cases they were most typically provided with the usufruct of a village and land, which allowed them to concentrate on other matters. These other matters would normally involve performing rituals, reciting their holy texts, that is, the Veda, teaching their sastras, sciences, and other such things. The underlying supposition was that the presence of a ritually active community of Brahmins would be advantageous for the kingdom. Some Brahmins, moreover, would play a role at the royal court, as advisors in both ritual and political matters. There is another reason why rulers may have been keen to have Brahmins at their courts. We know that the political history of South and Southeast Asia during the first millennium CE saw the rise and decline of numerous regional kingdoms. Inscriptions report ad nauseam the military feats of rulers who conquered and destroyed each other's territories without restraint. Assuming that these inscriptions are to at least some extent reliable, the military competence of many of these rulers left little to be desired. But more is required than mere military competence for acquiring and maintaining a kingdom. What these rulers needed, once they had won their battles, was practical advice as to how to run their kingdom, and how to protect it against unforeseen dangers. Brahmins were specialized in these two realms. Their undisturbed ritual occupations provided the best supernatural protection imaginable, and they combined that with theoretical competence in matters of polity. It is interesting to compare these Brahmanical skills with those that Buddhists had on offer. Buddhism had begun as a religion of people who had left society, and who had therefore very little to say about how society should be run. It is true that Buddhism did not remain for long a movement exclusively of renouncers. It may still have been like that during the realm of Ashoka, but there are clear indications from northern India that this changed during the last centuries BCE. Buddhism at that time came into the possession of monasteries and much else, and this is no doubt a reason why it came to depend ever more on the active support of political rulers. We have already seen one of the consequences of this new dependence. Buddhism adopted the language of the Brahmins, Sanskrit, because like the Brahmins it sought access to the centers of political power. Buddhism, then, needed the support of political rulers. What could it offer? In return, the Brahmins could offer a lot, enough to convince most rulers that they could not risk not to support Brahmins. How about the Buddhists? It appears that the Buddhists had a hard time competing with the Brahmins at the royal courts, and that this became, in the long run, one of the reasons why Buddhism did not survive in India. BSB, ch. 3.8. Brahmanism offered, apart from supernatural protection, much practical advice to rulers, how to organize society, how to run their kingdom, etc. Buddhism, still during the early centuries of the Common Era, offered nothing of the kind. As stated earlier, Buddhism had no vision of society and of how it should be run. True, there are a number of Buddhist texts that proffer advice to rulers, but close inspection only shows how useless this advice is. Kings should give money to the poor and avoid violence. This is hardly the advice that will assure a king long control in the ruthless environment of incessantly competing kingdoms characteristic of India during those centuries. Some of these Buddhist authors admit, though implicitly, that their advice is totally unrealistic, by recommending kings to become monks instead. With regard to the ritual protection offered by Buddhism to rulers, we can be brief. During the early centuries of the Common Era, they offered next to nothing of the kind. BSB, ch. 3. An inspection of the sources has led me to conclude that for a long time, say, during the first 5 centuries of the Common Era, Buddhism left many of the skills that might be useful for rulers to Brahmins. We saw that Buddhism came to adopt a semi-Brahmanical vision of society. This implied that certain activities were left to Brahmins. These included Of course, ritual activities and political counseling, but many other activities as well, among which are predicting the future on the basis of various indications and astrology. One of the surprising consequences of this is that there are practically no surviving names of Buddhists who engaged in astronomy and mathematics, this in spite of the fact that Buddhists were active in other sciences, such as medicine and, of course, philosophy. Astronomy and mathematics, in the Indian context, were inseparable from astrology, and astrology was the domain of Brahmins, not of Buddhists. In short, for a number of centuries Buddhism in India did not intrude into the realms of activity that the Brahmins considered their own. By the time they tried to change this, with the advent of Tantrism, it was too late. Buddhism had not been able to compete credibly with Brahmanism, and its decline may be looked upon as its inevitable consequence. In contrast to Buddhism, Brahmanism offered advantages that rulers could scarcely do without. This was not the result of historical coincidence. It can be argued that to at least some extent Brahmanism during the last centuries preceding the Common Era had prepared the ground, that it had developed the tools and methods which in due time turned out to be very efficacious. It is possible to look upon the Brahmanical literature composed during the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era as playing a role in the project Brahmanism was entering upon. This literature shows that the Brahmins of that period had two major concerns. On the one hand, they were concerned to create a separate identity for themselves. Brahmins are expected to follow a lifestyle that is different from all others. Purity plays a central role in this lifestyle and finds expression in the observance of numerous rituals and sacraments. Through the Brahmins' purity of descent both on the paternal and maternal side, and through the distance maintained from persons and things that are considered polluting. This concern finds expression in those texts that were primarily meant for internal consumption, among them various texts on dharma and ritual. Beside this, there are Brahmanical texts from this period that concentrate on the image that Brahmins were concerned to project onto society at large. A text like the Mahabharata projects an image of Brahmins as sometimes wise, sometimes unpredictable, but always powerful and scary. Brahmins like to live in peace in their hermitages, and may seem in this way inoffensive, but numerous stories remind us that they can be deadly if crossed. Political advice is given much attention, as are indications of how to fit into the social hierarchy that is the hallmark of Brahmanism. HPW, ch. 2. It would be worth a detailed study to analyze the model of Brahmanism that arose during the crucial centuries around the beginning of the Common Era. This model referred back, at least in part, to the Vedic tradition, but other aspects were quite new. Even new notions, such as the idea of the Brahmanical ashrama hermitage, an idea that is absent from Vedic literature, were presented as old as having been in existence from time immemorial. This model was to become surprisingly successful in subsequent centuries. Such a detailed analysis has not yet been undertaken. I hope that scholars will take up the challenge and join me in rethinking India's past along the lines here suggested. By way of conclusion, I wish to draw attention to some independent evidence showing the profound influence that Brahmanism exerted on Indian society. I had occasion to mention its emphasis on purity of descent. Strict rules applied not only to Brahmins, but also to other groups in society. Numerous texts warn that not abiding by these rules has dire consequences, in that offspring will not be accepted in the social groups to which their parents belong. These warnings had their effects. Genetic research shows that the practice of endogamy was established almost simultaneously, possibly by decree of the rulers, in upper caste populations of all geographical regions, about 70 generations before the present, probably during the reign of the Gupta rulers. 3 other studies appear to confirm this, so that it seems safe to conclude that a shift to endogamy took place during the first half of the first millennium CE in northern India. We are permitted to assume that the growing influence of Brahmanism played a role in this.